J. Richardson was born almost 3 months after his father. J.P. Richardson, better known as the Big Bopper, died in a violent Iowa plane crash that also killed 1950s rock stars Buddy Holly and Ritchie Valens on the day the music died, February 3, 1959. It was rock and roll's first great tragedy, and the tremor of that crash in a frozen field was felt around the world. By the time little Jay was born, the Bopper was settling comfortably into the muddy gumbo at Forest Lawn Cemetery. In 2007, Forest Lawn Cemetery had planned only to quietly move the Bopper's gravesite to a more visible location with a life-size statue and historic marker. However, the disinterment offered Jay a historic chance to say his first hello, and for forensic experts to examine the pop singer's unautopsied remains 48 years after his death. When Jay became old enough to remember his dreams, he was already dreaming most nights about the father he never knew, with the help of renowned forensic anthropologist Dr. Bill Bass, who helped positively identify the Lindbergh baby's long-dead remains and founded the Body Farm at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where he studies human decomposition. Jay hoped to answer a few unanswered questions about his father's death. The Bopper's first day above ground in more than 48 years was a lovely one. He died on a black night in light snow, and his corpse quickly froze solid. But that Tuesday morning in 2007 was all Texas spring under a pale blue sky, warm and bright. Jay arrived before dawn and sat alone in his truck near the grave. By the time a cemetery backhoe took its first bite of earth from the Bopper's grave, he had gathered with other onlookers, including rock historian Bill Griggs and the Bopper's one-time radio boss John Neal at graveside. Once the Bopper's inch-thick steel vault was hoisted from its muddy hole, it was taken to a more private workshop area, where it was cleaned and unsealed. A handful of cemetery workers and their somber supervisors hovered around it until the quarter-ton cap was finally lifted off, exposing to the mid-morning sun the Bopper's casket, which the world last saw in a photo taken at Broussard's funeral home in Beaumont in 1959. Sitting next to a funeral wreath sent by U.S. Army Private Elvis Presley, the casket looked extraordinarily intact after more than 48 years. Its few rusty spots were superficial, but a limey waterline a few inches short of its seal caused some concern. Inside a nearby shop, away from any prying eyes, funeral director Rodney Landry warned the 9 invited onlookers that he was inclined to believe there will be more than bones, but that what they were about to see will not be a pretty sight. He pointed to the doors that would be unlocked if they must leave quickly. A small valve was first unscrewed to let any trapped decomposition gases escape. The lofty shop quickly filled with an overpowering death stink that lingered all day and seeped into clothing, further worrying onlookers that the casket's contents might have rotted beyond recognition. Beyond a simple, jaw-clenched glance, the enormous metal building fell deathly silent as Landry unlocked the lid. Although he still didn't know what he'd see or how he'd respond, Jay stood as close as he could. Imagine if the first time you ever laid eyes on your father was when somebody lifted a casket lid to reveal a human body that had been ferociously damaged and buried for almost 50 years. Imagine being sickened by the sight of a father you not only admired, but resembled and recreated. The lid was lifted and Jay looked down upon a pale blue face, a familiar ghost. J.P. Richardson, who was only 28 when he died, was a well-preserved corpse dressed in a black suit and a blue and gray striped tie. His mottled, bluish face was slightly moldy and misshapen, perhaps by globs of mortician's putty needed to reconstruct his crushed skull. But he was no gelatinous pile of disarticulated bones, as some had expected. His chest had caved inward, his ringless fingers had mummified into curled, dark brown talons. He wore socks, but no shoes. Under his funeral home suit, he was encased in a union-all, a mortician's plastic garment that allows only the hands and head to be exposed, keeping horribly damaged bodies in reasonable form for shipment and reducing leakage of body fluids. No mementos had been stashed in the coffin, and the occupant's pockets were empty. All his personal effects had been given to his widow. Most remarkably, The Bopper's thick brown hair was still perfectly coiffed in his familiar 1950s crew cut. Several people pitched in to lift the still heavy but fragile body from the old casket onto a gurney, where it could be x-rayed by Bass and to radiologists. Was the Bopper killed by the impact of the crash? Did he survive and try to go for help, only to die 40 feet from the wreckage, where his body was found? Was he truly a victim in the wild conspiracy theories that there had been gunplay on the plane? "We're not doing this for history," Dr. Bass said privately, while waiting for the x-rays to be developed. "We're doing this for a family. We have the ability to solve some of their personal mysteries." There was no bullet, the x-rays showed, but few had expected this would turn into a crime scene investigation anyway. And the Bopper didn't survive the impact even for a moment, Bass determined. He suffered at least 3 death-dealing injuries that would have killed him before he took another breath: a crushed skull, a broken neck, and a grotesquely mashed ribcage. His other injuries were equally grievous, including a crumbled pelvis, a broken spine, a broken foot and ankle, and 2 compound fractures in each leg. The Bopper came undone. Almost no major bone in his body was unbroken. He died so quickly he might not even have had time to imagine it. "It answers the question that they all died instantly," historian Bill Griggs said later. "That's the good news in this tragedy. I've been talking to Dad all day," he said, "and after 48 years, he can still amaze me." In the outside world, a few people grumble that the autopsy was an unnecessary intrusion, even for a son. But it was, after all, the son's choice. "The Big Bopper belonged to the world," said Randy Steele, a close family friend. "But Jiles Perry Richardson belonged to Jay. And Jay finally got to say his hello and goodbye." Jay Richardson, the Bopper's son, planned to sell the empty casket on eBay to raise money for a musical show about his father, but was met with some bad press and decided, ultimately, to allow his father's casket to be displayed in the Texas Musicians Museum, which abruptly closed in May 2018. The Musicians Museum owner was a friend of Carol Estes, who happens to own the Roadside America Museum, and so until the Musicians Museum finds a new home, the casket is in the Roadside America Museum in Hillsboro, Texas.